The last thing I remember before my world shattered was the scent of lemons and vanilla, hanging warm and sweet in my kitchen. The cake was for my son, Michael. A simple lemon drizzle, his favorite since he was a little boy. I just set it on the cooling rack by the open window when the doorbell rang. I remember wiping my hands on my apron, a faint dusting of flour still on my fingertips, and feeling a small, quiet sense of contentment. Funny the things your mind holds on to. Not the loud, terrible moments, but the small, peaceful ones right before the storm hit. When I opened the door, it wasn't a neighbor or a delivery person. It was 2 police officers. Their faces were impassive, their uniforms a stark, dark blue against the cheerful yellow of my front door. For a moment, my heart seized with a familiar terror, the kind that every mother carries deep in her bones. I thought something had happened to Michael. My hand flew to my chest and I could barely get the words out. Is my son all right? One of the officers, a woman with tired eyes, gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He's fine, ma'am. The relief that washed over me was so immense it almost buckled my knees. But it was fleeting, replaced by a cold, creeping confusion when the other officer, a tall man with a stern jaw, spoke my name. Helen Gable? Yes, I said, my voice a little shaky, and then he said the words that made no sense. Words that felt like they belonged in a television show. Not on the welcome mat of my quiet suburban home. You're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. I think I laughed, a short, startled, disbelieving sound. I'm sorry, I said, trying to smile. I think there's been a terrible mistake. I'm a librarian, part-time. They didn't smile back. The cold reality of the moment began to seep in as the male officer produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click as they locked around my wrists was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It echoed in the sudden ringing silence of my peaceful afternoon. They led me past my rose garden, past the window where my son's favorite cake was cooling, and into a world I didn't recognize. A world of cold leather seats, sterile smells, and the chilling finality of a closing door. That's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was a nightmare, and I had a sickening feeling that I knew exactly who was behind it. Before Chloe, my life was beautifully, predictably simple. It had been just me and Michael for so long after my husband, Richard, passed away a decade ago. Michael was only 16 then, and we clung to each other like life rafts in a sea of grief. We navigated those first few years together, finding a new rhythm for our little family of 2. He was my rock and I hope was his. Our home was a small 2-bedroom house that Richard and I had bought when Michael was born. It was filled with the quiet echoes of a life well lived. The worn spot on the armchair where Richard used to read the paper. The faint pencil marks on the doorframe charting Michael's growth from a toddler to a young man who towered over me. My days were structured around comforting routines. I worked 3 days a week at the town library, a job I adored. There's a certain peace in being surrounded by stories, a quiet order to the Dewey Decimal System that I found deeply soothing. The rest of my time was spent in my garden, coaxing life from the soil, or in my kitchen trying out new recipes. Every Sunday, without fail, Michael would come for dinner. It was our sacred tradition. He'd arrive around 6, always bringing me a small bouquet from the market, and we would talk for hours over a home-cooked meal. He'd tell me about his work as an architect, the new buildings he was designing, the frustrations of dealing with city permits. I'd tell him about the funny things patrons said at the library or the progress of my tomato plants. He was a good man, my Michael. Kind, thoughtful, perhaps a little too trusting at times. A trait he inherited from his father. He saw the best in people, which was a beautiful quality, but one that always made me a little nervous for him. When he told me he had met someone, I was thrilled for him. He was 28, and I'd been hoping he would find a partner to share his life with. Her name is Chloe, he'd said, his whole face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Oh, she's incredible. The first time I met her, I understood his awe. Chloe was stunning. Tall and slender with sleek, dark hair and eyes the color of moss. She had a polished confidence that filled the room. She was a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown, and she spoke about her work with a sharp intelligence that was both impressive and a little intimidating. She looked at my son with an adoration that seemed to melt away all his insecurity. She said all the right things. She complimented my home, raved about my cooking, and listened raptly as I told stories about Michael as a boy. She called me Helen, never Mrs. Gable, insisting we would be family. I wanted to love her. I truly did. For Michael's sake, I was desperate too. But there was something just beneath the surface. A flicker in her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking. A smile that was a little too quick, a little too perfect, as if it were rehearsed. I told myself I was being foolish, just another overprotective mother finding fault with the woman who was stealing her son. I pushed the feeling down, chalking it up to my own loneliness, my own fear of being left behind. I smiled. I poured her another glass of wine, and I told Michael she was absolutely fantastic. They married 6 months later in a lavish ceremony at a country club I knew Michael couldn't afford. When I gently asked him about the cost, he just smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mom. Chloe's got it handled. She's a genius with money." I wore a simple navy blue dress, the one Richard had always loved. Standing in that sea of silk and champagne, I felt like a little rowboat adrift next to a fleet of gleaming yachts. Chloe was breathtaking in a designer gown, her laughter echoing through the grand ballroom. But I watched her. I watched the way she touched Michael's arm, a proprietary gesture, like she was marking her territory. I watched her interact with her own parents, a stiff, formal exchange of air kisses that held no warmth. There was a transactional quality to all her interactions, a checklist of social graces being ticked off one by one. After the wedding, things began to change, slowly at first, then with an unnerving momentum. My Sunday dinners with Michael became less frequent. The first time he called to cancel, he sounded genuinely apologetic. "Chloe's firm is having a mixer, Mom. It's a big networking thing for her career. I should really be there to support her. We'll do it next week, I promise." Next week became the week after. Then it was a weekend trip to the wine country with Chloe's friends. Then a charity gala. Each excuse was plausible, each delivered with my son's earnest, loving tone. But the pattern was undeniable. I was being gently, methodically edged out. The sacred space we had carved out for ourselves was being paved over. The first real alarm bell, the one I couldn't silence with self-doubt, rang on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 months after the wedding. Chloe had invited me to lunch at their new minimalist apartment. It was the first time she had extended an invitation without Michael present, and a small, hopeful part of me thought this was her attempt to forge a genuine connection finally. She served a quinoa salad that tasted of nothing and sparkling water with a slice of cucumber. As we sat at her glass dining table, she steered the conversation towards finances. "Helen," she began, her voice smooth as silk, "Michael and I were looking over our long-term financial plans, and naturally we were thinking of you." I felt a prickle of unease. "Oh, that's very thoughtful, but I'm quite all right. Richard left me well provided for." She smiled, a patient, slightly condescending smile that made me feel like a child. "Of course, but the market has changed so much since then. Your portfolio is likely very conservative. You could be getting much better returns. I could manage it for you. Integrate your assets with ours. It would be simpler for everyone in the long run, and I wouldn't even charge my usual fee. Your family, after all." The offer hung in the air between us, cloaked in generosity but feeling like a trap. All my life, Richard and I had managed our own savings. It was our life's work, a testament to our partnership, held in a modest but secure portfolio at the local bank where our banker, Mr. Henderson, had known me for 20 years. The thought of handing that over to this polished stranger, this woman with cold eyes and a perfect smile, sent a chill down my spine. I tried to keep my voice light. "That's a very generous offer, Chloe, but I'm comfortable with how things are. Mr. Henderson at the bank does a fine job." The mask slipped for just a second. A flash of sharp annoyance crossed her features before being replaced by that same patient smile. "Suit yourself," she said, taking a delicate sip of her water. "It was just a thought. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." But her tone said something else entirely. It said, "You foolish older woman." It was the first time I felt like she wasn't just trying to win my son, but that she saw me as an obstacle. An old, outdated piece of furniture in her sleek, new life that needed to be managed or perhaps removed. I left her apartment that day with the taste of quinoa and dread in my mouth. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my gut that this was only the beginning. The following weeks were a masterclass in subtle manipulation. Chloe was too bright to be overtly hostile. Instead, it was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. She started helping me. She'd rearranged the furniture in my living room while I was at the library, claiming it opened up the space. She replaced my worn, comfortable ceramic mugs with a set of stark white ones that felt cold in my hands, calling my old ones a bacterial hazard. Each act was framed as a kindness, a gesture of care, making my resistance seem ungrateful and crotchety. When I tried to talk to Michael about it, he didn't understand. "Mom, she's just trying to help. She loves you." How could I explain that her help felt like an erasure? That she was slowly scrubbing away the traces of my life, of his father, from our home? I sounded like a jealous, petty older woman, so I stopped trying. I just started putting things back the way they were after she left, a quiet, stubborn act of defiance. The real turning point came when Michael's architecture firm hit a rough patch. A significant project lost its funding and whispers of layoffs circulated. Michael came to me one evening, looking more worried than I had seen him since his father's illness. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a boy, and confessed he was afraid of losing his job. "Chloe's been amazing though. he said, trying to find a silver lining. She went through all our finances, made a new budget. She says we'll be fine, but we have to be smart. A few days later, Chloe called me. Her voice was grave, concerned. Helen, I'm so glad I caught you. I need to ask a huge favor and please feel free to say no. It's about Michael. My heart immediately softened. Of course, dear. Anything. With the uncertainty at his firm, she began, her tone practiced and somber. I've been trying to shore up our liquid assets. We have a fantastic investment opportunity. Something short-term with a guaranteed high return. It could give us the cushion we need to weather this storm. But the window is closing fast. We're just a little short on the initial capital. She paused, and I could hear the feigned vulnerability in her voice. I was wondering if you would be willing to lend us $20,000? Just for 90 days. I've drawn up a formal loan agreement and everything. You'll have it back with interest before you even know it's gone. My instinct screamed no. Everything about it felt wrong. The urgency, the pressure, the way she was leveraging my concern for Michael. But then I pictured my son's worried face, the fear in his eyes. He was my boy. If he were in trouble, how could I refuse? Of course, Chloe, I heard myself say. For Michael, of course. Oh, Helen, thank you, she gushed, the relief in her voice sounding almost genuine. You're a lifesaver. I'll email you the details. Could you wire the money to this account? It's a special high-yield account I set up just for this investment. The next day I went to my bank. I sat across from Mr. Henderson, a kind man with thinning white hair, and explained the situation. He looked over the account information Chloe had sent. His brow furrowed. Helen, he said, adjusting his glasses. This is an offshore account. The routing numbers are for a bank in the Cayman Islands. Oh, I said, feeling a fresh wave of unease. Chloe said it was a special investment account. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his expression kind but concerned. These accounts are often used to, well, to make funds difficult to trace. Are you absolutely certain about this? I hesitated, but the thought of Michael losing his job, of that look on his face, pushed my doubts away. It's for my son, I said, as if that explained everything. Reluctantly, he processed the transfer. I watched the numbers leave my account and felt a hollow pit in my stomach. 90 days came and went. I didn't want to bring it up, not wanting to seem like I was pressuring them. I waited another 2 weeks before I finally called Chloe. Oh, the investment, she said, her voice breezy and light as if she'd forgotten entirely. Right. There was a small delay in the liquidation. Market fluctuations, you know how it is. It's all perfectly normal. It should be clear in another week or two. Don't you worry. Another month passed. I started calling more frequently. Her excuses became more elaborate, more dismissive. It was a paperwork issue, an international holiday delay, a problem with the exchange rate. Her tone shifted from breezy to annoyed. I was no longer a generous mother-in-law. I was a nuisance. Finally, I told her I would have to talk to Michael about it. The silence on the other end of the line was frigid. I don't think that's a good idea, Helen, she said, her voice losing all its warmth. You know how stressed he is. Burdening him with this, it would be cruel. Just be patient. But I had been patient, and I was done being patient. That weekend, I waited for a moment when I knew Michael would be home alone, and I drove to their apartment. I found him in his study, sketching at his drafting table. I took a deep breath. Michael, honey, I need to talk to you about the money I lent to Chloe. He looked up, his expression immediately guarded. What about it? I explained everything. The 90-day loan, the offshore account, the endless excuses. As I spoke, his face hardened. A look of disappointment, of anger, replaced the open, loving expression he usually reserved for me. I can't believe this, he said, shaking his head. Chloe told me you were getting anxious. I told her you weren't like that. He stood up, his voice rising. She's trying so hard, Mom. She's trying to build a life for us. And all you can do is hound her over a loan that you offered? After all she's done for you, for us? I stared at him, my heart breaking. She told you I offered it? Michael, she called me. She asked me for it. She said you were in trouble. He scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. She didn't need to ask. She told me you generously offered to help. And she was so touched she insisted on drawing up a loan agreement to make you feel secure. And now you're accusing her of, what? Stealing from you? My wife. I saw her then. I saw Chloe's poison at work. She had twisted the narrative so perfectly, painting me as a clinging, paranoid older woman and herself as the gracious, misunderstood daughter-in-law. She had isolated me, turning my own son against me with a story that was just plausible enough to believe. Michael, that's not what happened, I pleaded, my voice trembling. You know what, Mom? He said, his voice cold. I think you need to leave. You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. Chloe will handle the money. Just give us some space. He turned his back on me, physically turning away, and in that moment, I felt a chasm open between us, broader and deeper than I ever could have imagined. I walked out of their apartment, my own son's angry words echoing in my ears. I had lost the $20,000. That much was clear. But as I drove home through the blurry, rain-streaked streets, I realized I had lost something infinitely more valuable. And the worst part was, I had a terrifying feeling that Chloe was just getting started. This was the discovery. This was the betrayal. I was sitting in my car, parked in my own driveway, unable to go inside. The house felt empty. My world felt empty. I had been played not just for money but for my son's love. And she had won. For the next few weeks, a heavy silence fell between my son and me. My calls went to his voicemail. My texts were met with short, sterile replies. Busy at work. In a meeting. Chloe and I are away for the weekend. I knew it was her, standing just behind his shoulder, whispering in his ear, feeding him her version of reality. My every attempt to reach him only proved her point, that I was needy, that I was unstable, that I couldn't let go. The isolation was a physical ache. My house, once a sanctuary of warm memories, now felt cavernous and cold. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a reminder of the seconds, minutes, and hours that Michael was slipping further and further away from me. I stopped baking. I let the weeds creep into my rose garden. The joy had been siphoned out of my life. I knew I couldn't let it stand. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was a fight for my son, for the truth. Chloe had built a fortress of lies around him, and I had to find a way to breach the walls. But how? My word against hers. A heartbroken mother against a brilliant, manipulative financial advisor. I had no proof, only my gut instinct and the ache in my chest. My first thought was to go back to the bank. Mr. Henderson could trace the wire transfer and demonstrate that the funds had been deposited into an account other than a legitimate investment account. I made an appointment and sat in his office, feeling small and desperate. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed with sympathy. "Helen, I can confirm the funds were received by the bank in the Cayman Islands," he explained gently. "But that's where the trail ends for me. The privacy laws there are incredibly strict. Once the money is in an account like that, it's a black box. Without a court order or a federal investigation, there's no way to see where it went from there." A federal investigation. The word sounded so foreign, so extreme. I was a part-time librarian, not a character in a spy movie. I left the bank feeling more defeated than ever. Chloe had chosen her weapon perfectly. The money was gone, vanished into a labyrinth of international finance where I couldn't follow. I spent my evenings online, falling down rabbit holes of articles about fraud, embezzlement, and offshore accounts. My search history looked like that of a criminal, not a grieving mother. I learned about shell corporations, about layering funds, about how easy it was for someone with Chloe's expertise to make money disappear. The more I read, the more I understood the terrifying scope of her deception. She hadn't just pocketed my $20,000. She had likely laundered it, making it untraceable, and in the process making me look like a fool. But in my research I stumbled upon a different idea. If I couldn't trace my money, I could trace hers. Chloe lived a life of expensive taste, designer clothes, five-star weekend trips, that lavish wedding. She was a successful financial advisor, yes, but was she that successful? Michael was a junior architect. I knew his salary. It was good, but it wasn't enough to fund the lifestyle they were living. My action when it came felt both clever and deeply transgressive. I knew Michael and Chloe would be away for a long weekend in Aspen. She'd posted a picture on social media, the two of them clinking champagne glasses on a private jet with the caption, "Best husband in the world surprised me for our anniversary." The post was a performance, a curated fantasy for her followers. But it gave me an opportunity, a 48-hour window. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove to their apartment building. I still had the spare key Michael had given me years ago, a key he had surely forgotten about. Letting myself into their home felt like a profound violation, but I pushed the feeling down. This wasn't snooping. It was an investigation. I was a mother fighting for her son. Their apartment was cold and sterile, like a hotel suite. There were no family photos on the walls. No sentimental clutter. The only pictures were of the two of them, perfectly posed, please. I went straight to the small office off the living room. It was Chloe's domain. The desk was immaculate, a sleek laptop closed neatly next to a single artfully placed orchid. I started with the filing cabinet. The first drawer was filled with innocuous household documents, appliance warranties, insurance policies, car titles. But the bottom drawer was locked. My heart leaped. People don't lock drawers containing electricity bills. I didn't have a key, and for a moment I felt a surge of despair. But then my librarian's mind took over. I thought of all the mystery novels I'd cataloged over the years. I went to the kitchen, found a butter knife and a sturdy metal nail file, and returned to the office. It was clumsy work and I scraped my knuckles, but after 10 minutes of frantic jimmying, I heard a soft click. The drawer slid open. Inside there weren't files but several leather-bound ledgers. I opened the first one. It wasn't a personal journal. It was a meticulous, handwritten record of financial transactions. Columns of numbers, dates, account codes, and names. I didn't recognize most of the names, but then my own name jumped out at me. Helen Gable, loan, $20,000. Next to it in a separate column was a note, transferred to SI Holdings. There was no mention of an investment or a promise of repayment. It was just an entry, cold and clinical. As I flipped through the pages, a sickening pattern emerged. There were other names, many of them elderly sounding. Arthur Finch, estate management, $50,000. Eleanor Vance, annuity transfer, $75,000. Beside each name was a similar notation, a transfer to an anonymous-sounding holding company, SI Holdings, Apex Global, a dozen others. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about my $20,000. This was bigger. This was a systematic scheme. Chloe wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law. She was a predator. She was targeting vulnerable people, likely her own clients, and siphoning off their life savings into a web of shell companies. My little loan was just a drop in the bucket, a test run on her own family. I took out my phone and, with trembling hands, began taking pictures of every single page. Page after page of damning evidence. The meticulous handwriting, the sheer scale of the fraud. It was all here. This was the proof I needed. This was the key to blowing her fortress of lies to pieces. I had just finished photographing the last page when I heard a key in the front door. My blood turned to ice. My body went completely rigid. They weren't supposed to be back until Sunday evening. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was Saturday afternoon. My carefully planned window had just slammed shut. Panic seized me. My mind went blank. The front door opened and I heard Chloe's voice, light and musical. "I'm just going to grab my laptop charger. I can't believe I forgot it. I'll be right out." Michael's voice followed, farther away from the hallway. "Hey honey, I'll keep the car running." There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The office was a small glass-walled box off the main living area. I was utterly exposed. My only option was to shove the ledger back into the drawer, but my hands were shaking so violently I could barely grasp it. I managed to slide it in, but in my haste I didn't lock it. I just pushed it shut and stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Chloe walked into the living room, her eyes on her phone, and then she looked up. She saw me. The perfectly curated mask of pleasantness fell from her face, not in a flash of anger, but in a slow, chilling dissolve. Her eyes, those moss-green eyes, went flat and cold. All the manufactured warmth vanished, replaced by something reptilian and utterly devoid of emotion. We stared at each other for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of my own blood in my ears. Her gaze flickered from my face down to the desk, to the slightly askew filing cabinet, and then back to me. A slow, terrible smile spread across her lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of triumph, of checkmate. "Helen," she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "What are you doing here?" Before I could even stammer out a lie, she took a step towards the office. She didn't look in the drawer. He didn't need to. She saw the butter knife and the nail file I'd left on the desk in my panic. She saw the faint scratches around the lock, and she knew. She knew I had found it. I thought she would scream or call Michael or threaten me. She did none of those things. She walked over to her laptop, unplugged the charger, and turned back to me. Her composure was terrifying. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice as calm and steady as if she were discussing the weather. It was the calm of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. "You've made things so much more complicated." "Chloe," I started, my voice a weak croak. "I know what you've been doing. The ledgers, the names. You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, cutting me off, her voice still unervingly serene. She glanced towards the front door where Michael was waiting. "I think it's time for you to go." I stood my ground, a foolish, terrified bravery surging through me. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to show Michael. I have pictures. It's all on my phone." Her cold smile widened. "Do you really think he'll believe you? An unstable, hysterical mother who broke into our home? Who do you think he's going to trust, Helen?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Give me the phone." "No," I said, clutching my purse where my phone, my only proof, was safely zipped inside. For the first time, a flicker of genuine anger flashed in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She took a deep, theatrical breath, as if calming herself. "Fine, have it your way." She walked past me out of the office and called out in a voice that was suddenly filled with panicked tears. "Michael! Michael, can you come in here? Something's wrong." My blood ran cold. I knew what she was doing. She was setting the stage. Michael came running in, his face etched with concern. "Chloe, what is it? What's wrong? He stopped dead when he saw me standing in the office. His eyes darted from my pale, frightened face to Chloe, who was now clutching her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. She had tears streaming down her face, a masterful performance of distress. "Your mother," she sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I came in and she was here. She was going through my things. She has some crazy idea that I'm stealing money. She threatened me, Michael." "What?" Michael looked at me, his face a storm of confusion, disbelief, and dawning anger. "Mom, what is going on? Why are you here?" "She's lying, Michael," I pleaded, my voice desperate. "She's the one who's stealing. I have proof. It's in her ledger. She's stealing from her clients. See," Chloe cried, burying her face in Michael's chest. "She's delusional. I told you she wasn't well. She's obsessed." Michael held Chloe, stroking her hair, glaring at me over her shoulder. It was a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. But it wasn't her betrayal he saw. It was mine. "I want you to leave," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Right now. And don't come back." He walked me to the door, his hand firmly on my arm as if I were a trespasser, a criminal. Chloe stayed behind, her sobs echoing in the sterile apartment. As he opened the door, I made one last desperate attempt. "Michael, please, just look at the pictures on my phone. That's all I ask." "I don't want to see your pictures, Mom," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. "I want you to get help." He closed the door in my face. The click of the lock was a gunshot in the silent hallway. I stood there for a long moment, trembling, defeated. I had the truth in my pocket, but it wasn't beneficial. She had already won. As I rode the elevator down, a new, more terrifying thought began to form. Chloe wasn't just going to let this go. I had seen her secrets. A woman like that, a woman who could lie and steal with such chilling composure, wouldn't just leave a loose end like me dangling. I had backed her into a corner and now she was going to strike back. I just had no idea how devastatingly final her retaliation would be. The drive home was a blur. I clutched my phone like a holy relic, the evidence for a crime no one would believe I'd uncovered. Little did I know that Chloe wasn't just planning to discredit me, she was planning to destroy me. 2 days later, the police showed up at my door with a warrant. They said they'd received an anonymous tip. They turned my house upside down. In the bottom of my gardening shed, tucked away in an old terracotta pot, they found several official-looking financial documents and a stack of prepaid credit cards. Documents that detailed the very shell corporations I had seen in Chloe's ledger, SI Holdings, Apex Global. And they found a laptop, a cheap burner laptop. When they opened it, they found spreadsheets meticulously tracking the movement of funds from her clients' accounts into the same shell corporations. My $20,000 was the first entry. It was a perfect, diabolical frame. She had taken her own crimes and planted the evidence in my home. She had used my own discovery against me. The anonymous tip, of course, had come from her. She had probably made the call from a burner phone, her voice disguised. A concerned friend of the family worried about my erratic behavior. That's when they arrested me. As they read me my rights, my mind wasn't on the police or the handcuffs. It was on Chloe, on her cold, triumphant smile. She hadn't just removed me from my son's life. She had put me in a cage. The world inside a jail cell is a world stripped of color and sound. Everything is gray concrete, dull orange jumpsuits, and the relentless echoing clang of metal on metal. The acrid smell of disinfectant and despair replaced the sweet scent of lemons and vanilla from my kitchen. Time loses its shape. Days bleed into nights, marked only by the changing of guards, and the tasteless meals slid through a slot in the door. My first few days were a blur of shock and disbelief. I was fingerprinted, photographed, and processed like a common criminal. I was assigned a public defender, a young, overworked man named David who looked at me with a mixture of pity and skepticism. I tried to explain everything to him, about Chloe, the ledgers, the $20,000, the way she had turned Michael against me. I told him about the pictures on my phone. "The police confiscated your phone as evidence," he said, sighing as we sat in a small, windowless meeting room. "And the prosecutor is claiming the photos you took are your own records of the crime. They're saying you broke into your daughter-in-law's home to destroy evidence when you realized she was getting suspicious." I stared at him, the absurdity of it stealing my breath. "But the handwriting in the ledgers, they can test it. It's Chloe's handwriting, not mine." David scribbled a note on his legal pad. "We can file a motion for a handwriting analysis, but she'll claim you forged it. Helen, the evidence against you is substantial. They have the burner laptop, the financial documents, all found on your property. They have a sworn statement from your daughter-in-law detailing your erratic and threatening behavior. And they have your son corroborating her story. That was the blow that knocked the air from my lungs. Michael, he had stated to me. He truly believed it. He thought I was a thief, a liar, a criminal. Chloe had done it. She had severed our bond completely, not with a knife, but with a web of perfectly crafted lies. Bail was set at an astronomical $500,000, an amount I could never hope to pay. The prosecutor argued I was a flight risk, citing the offshore accounts I supposedly controlled. Chloe's accounts. I was trapped. The loneliness was the worst part. I was utterly alone, cut off from everything I had ever known. My name was in the local paper. Librarian accused in sophisticated fraud scheme. My quiet, respectable life had been turned into a spectacle. I wondered what my neighbors thought, the ladies from my book club, the patrons at the library. I felt a shame so profound it was like a physical weight on my chest. My only lifeline was David. He was young, but he was tenacious. He saw the flicker of truth in my desperate eyes. He started digging. He spent hours with me, going over every detail of my relationship with Chloe, every conversation, every interaction. He was trying to find a crack, any minor inconsistency in her story. Think, Helen, he'd say, his tone urgent but kind. Chloe is meticulous, but people like that, they have a blind spot. They're so confident, so arrogant, they always make one mistake. We just have to find it. We focused on the evidence planted in my shed. The burner laptop was a dead end. It had been wiped clean of any identifying information beyond the incriminating files. The documents were convincing forgeries of bank statements and incorporation papers. But the prepaid credit cards, that felt different. Why plant the cards? I asked David one afternoon, my head aching from lack of sleep. If the money was all in offshore accounts, why would I need a stack of untraceable credit cards? Exactly, David said, his eyes lighting up. It feels redundant, like she was trying too hard to make you look guilty. Let's focus on the cards. The police report says they were all activated within the last month. He put in a request for the activation records and security footage from the stores where the cards were purchased. It was a long shot. Chloe was smart. She would have used cash, worn a hat, and kept her head down. Days turned into a week, then two. I tried to keep my spirit from breaking. I read books from the meager prison library. I walked endless circles in the small exercise yard, feeling the sterile sunlight on my face. I thought of Michael. I didn't feel anger towards him, only a deep, bottomless sorrow. He was a victim in this as much as I was. He was being poisoned and he didn't even know it. One afternoon, David came for our meeting, and for the first time he was smiling. Not a big smile, but a slight, hopeful twitch of his lips. I think we've got something, Helen, he said, spreading a series of grainy still photos across the metal table. They were security camera images from a convenience store on the other side of town. They showed a woman in a hoodie and sunglasses buying a stack of prepaid credit cards with cash. Her face was obscured, her identity completely hidden. My heart sank. You can't see who it is. No, David said, his finger tapping one of the photos. You can't, but look at this. He pointed to the woman's wrist. There, just peeking out from the cuff of her hoodie, was a bracelet. A very distinctive bracelet. It was a delicate silver chain with a single, unique, moss-green agate charm. I gasped. I recognized it instantly. Michael gave that to her for their 1-month anniversary. He told me he had it custom-made. He said the stone matched her eyes. It was the mistake. The tiny, arrogant flaw in her perfect plan. In her rush to build my cage, she had worn a piece of her own identity. She was so confident no one would ever look this closely, so sure of her own superiority, that she had overlooked the one thing that could tie her to the crime. This is it, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a fierce, surging hope. It's a start, David cautioned, but he couldn't hide the excitement in his voice. A jury might see this and have reasonable doubt, but it's still your word against hers. What we need now is to find one of the other victims. Someone from that ledger who is willing to speak up. The list of names from the photos on my phone was our only guide. Arthur Finch, Eleanor Vance. David started making calls, but it was a brick wall. Some numbers were disconnected. Others who answered were wary, confused, or in denial. Chloe had likely told them the same story she told me about market fluctuations and paperwork delays. They trusted their brilliant financial advisor. Then David got a call back. It was from Eleanor Vance's daughter. Her mother had passed away 2 months ago from a sudden stroke. While sorting through her mother's finances, the daughter had found records of the annuity transfer to one of Chloe's shell corporations. The money, her mother's entire life savings, was gone. She had been trying to get answers from Chloe's firm for weeks, but had been stonewalled. When David told her about my case, the ledgers, everything, everything clicked into place. She was angry, and she was willing to testify. We had it. We had the bracelet and another victim. The first crack in Chloe's fortress had appeared. For the first time since I'd smelled the scent of lemons and vanilla on that terrible afternoon, I felt like I could breathe again. The fight wasn't over, but I was no longer a lone voice crying in the wilderness. The truth was finally starting to find its way into the light. The trial felt like a slow-motion dream. I sat beside David at the defendant's table, dressed in a simple blouse and skirt he had brought for me, trying to look like the librarian I was, not the criminal they had made me out to be. The courtroom was a sterile, wood-paneled box, filled with strangers who were there to pass judgment on my life. Across the room, Chloe sat with the prosecution, the picture of a wronged and terrified victim. She wore muted, conservative suits, her hair neatly pulled back. She would occasionally dab at her eyes with a tissue. A perfect, silent performance for the jury. The most painful part was seeing Michael. He sat in the front row, directly behind Chloe, a pillar of support for his victimized wife. He wouldn't look at me. When our eyes accidentally met, his were filled with a cold, hard anger that felt like a physical blow. He believed her. He thought it all. Each time I saw his face, my heart broke anew. The prosecution laid out its case with brutal efficiency. They presented the evidence found in my shed, the burner laptop, the forged documents, the credit cards. They called a digital forensics expert who testified that the fraud was orchestrated from that very laptop. They presented Chloe's sworn statement, and then they called her to the stand. She was brilliant. Her voice was soft, trembling at just the right moments. She painted a picture of a lonely, resentful mother-in-law who had become obsessed and unstable after her son's marriage. She described my erratic behavior, my delusional accusations. She recounted the day she found me in her apartment, twisting my desperate search for truth into a terrifying home invasion. I was so scared, she said, her voice cracking as she looked at the jury. I loved Helen. I wanted us to be a family, but she couldn't accept that Michael had a new woman in his life. Money. I think it was just her way of trying to control us. The prosecution asked her about my $20,000 loan. She offered it to us, Chloe said, shaking her head sadly. She insisted. She said she wanted to feel involved in our lives. We were so touched. When she started demanding it back with these wild accusations, we were just heartbroken and confused. It was a masterful work of fiction, and the jury was captivated. I could see it in their sympathetic glances. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, the truth feeling smaller and more powerless with every lie she told. Then it was David's turn. He was calm, methodical. He started with Eleanor Vance's daughter. She took the stand and, in a clear, angry voice, told the court about her mother's life savings, the $75,000 that had vanished after being transferred by Chloe. The prosecution objected, calling it irrelevant to my case, but David argued it showed a pattern of behavior. The judge, a thoughtful older woman, allowed it. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the faces of the jury. Next, David called an expert jeweler to the stand. He showed him a high-resolution printout of the security camera photo, zeroing in on the bracelet. He then showed him the design sketch Michael had commissioned, which David had managed to get from the jeweler who made it. Is this the same piece of jewelry? David asked. In my professional opinion, the jeweler said, peering at the images, it is a 100% match. The cut of the stone, the clasp design, the length of the chain. It's a custom piece. It's unique. A low murmur went through the courtroom. I saw Chloe's hand, which had been resting on the table, clench into a fist. Her serene composure finally cracked. But the final, most crucial part of our defense rested on Chloe herself. David called her back to the stand for cross-examination. He started gently, asking her about her work, her success. He let her build up her own ego, her own sense of intellectual superiority. Then he changed tack. Ms. Gable, he said, his voice casual, your husband's mother stands accused of a very sophisticated financial crime, creating shell corporations, moving money offshore. It requires a certain level of expertise, wouldn't you agree? I suppose so, Chloe said, wary. Expertise that a part-time librarian from the suburbs is unlikely to have, but expertise that a highly successful senior financial advisor, someone like yourself, would have in abundance. Objection, the prosecutor called out. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Chin, get to your point. David nodded. He walked over to the evidence table and picked up a copy of the ledger pages, the photos from my phone. He put one on the projector so the entire courtroom could see the neat columns, the names, the numbers. My name was clearly visible. So were the names Arthur Finch and Eleanor Vance. This is a page from the records the prosecution claims my client created, David said. He turned back to Chloe. Do you recognize this document? No, Chloe said, her voice tight. I've never seen it before. Are you sure? David pressed. Because the handwriting is very neat, very precise. Almost like the handwriting of someone who spends their days making meticulous financial records. He then produced another document. It was a simple birthday card. This is a card you wrote to your husband, is it not? It was entered as evidence by the prosecution to establish your loving relationship. He placed the card under the projector, next to the ledger page. The handwriting was identical. The distinctive loop of the yin gable, the sharp angular way she wrote her T's. It was undeniable. The courtroom was silent. Chloe stared at the screen, her face ashen. The mask was gone. All that was left was the cold, raw panic of a cornered animal. It seems, Miss Gable, David said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, that the person who created these fraudulent records has the exact same handwriting as you. Can you explain that to the jury? Chloe opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the prosecutor, at the judge, at the jury, her eyes wide with desperation. And then she looked at Michael. And in that moment, Michael finally saw it. I watched his face as the entire artifice crumbled. The dawning horror, the sickening realization, the profound, gut-wrenching betrayal. It wasn't my betrayal he was seeing now. It was hers. His face, which had been a mask of anger towards me, crumpled into a mosaic of pain and disbelief. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and stared at his wife on the stand. Chloe, he whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. Did you? She couldn't answer. She just stared back at him, her guilt radiating from her in waves. That was the moment the trial ended. The verdict, when it came a day later, was just a formality. Not guilty. The words washed over me, but I barely heard them. All I could see was my son's broken face. The legal battle was over, but the real wreckage was beginning to be surveyed. As the courtroom doors opened and I walked out into the light, a free woman, I knew that for my son the prison was just being built. The moment the judge said not guilty, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The courtroom noise faded to a distant hum. David put a steadying hand on my arm. Freedom didn't feel like a triumphant explosion of joy. It felt like the quiet, trembling relief of a fever breaking. I walked out of the courthouse and blinked in the bright afternoon sun. The air, fresh and cool, felt like a luxury. David drove me home in his beat-up sedan. We didn't speak much. There were no words big enough for what had happened. When he pulled up to my curb in front of my little house with its slightly overgrown rose bushes, he finally turned to me. The district attorney is filing charges against Chloe, he said quietly. With the testimony from Ms. Vance's daughter and the evidence from your trial, they have a strong case. She was taken into custody from the courthouse. She won't be getting bail. I nodded, feeling profound sadness rather than elation. A life ruined, several lives ruined. There were no real winners here. Thank you, David, I said, my voice thick with emotion, for everything. You gave me my life back. He just smiled, a tired but genuine smile. You were telling the truth, Helen. That makes my job a lot easier. Walking into my own home was a surreal experience. It still bore the scars of the police search. Drawers were ajar, books were pulled from shelves, and a fine layer of dust covered everything. In the kitchen, on the cooling rack where I'd left it, was the lemon drizzle cake. It was hard and stale, a fossil of the life I had before the doorbell rang. I picked it up, carried it outside, and crumbled it into the garden bed for the birds. A strange, symbolic funeral for my own innocence. I spent the next 2 days cleaning. I scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and put every book back in its proper place on the shelves. With each act of restoration, I felt like I was reclaiming not just my home but myself. I pruned the roses, pulling the weeds that had choked them. I needed to see life, to nurture it back into order. Michael didn't come. He didn't call. A part of me understood. What could he possibly say? The shame and guilt he must be feeling were a prison of their own. I didn't push. I knew he had to find his own way back to me in his own time. On the third evening, as I was sitting in my armchair reading, the doorbell rang. My heart leaped into my throat. For a second, the old terror returned. I took a deep breath and opened the door. It was Michael. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't shaved. He just stood on my welcome mat, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, unable to look at me. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the single word. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and held the door open. He walked in, hesitating in the entryway as if he were a stranger. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with so much pain, so much regret, that it took my breath away. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, and then the dam broke. He collapsed into my arms, his body shaking with deep, racking sobs. He was a little boy again, crying in his mother's arms. I held him tightly, stroking his hair, my own tears silently streaming down my face. There were no accusations, no "I told you so's." There was only the shared, immense grief for what we had both lost. for the trust that had been so cruelly shattered. We sat at the kitchen table for hours. He told me everything about how Chloe had fed him a steady diet of subtle lies about me for months, how she had made him feel like he was protecting her from his unstable mother. The shame poured out of him. How could I have believed her? He asked, his voice raw. How could I not have seen it? She was my wife, and you're my mother. She's a sickness, Michael, I said softly, taking his hand. She preys on people's best instincts. She used your love and your loyalty against you. Against us. The healing was slow. It wasn't a single conversation, but 1,000 small moments. Michael filed for divorce immediately. He started coming over for Sunday dinners again. At first they were quiet, somber affairs. We were both fragile, carefully navigating the minefield of our shared trauma. But slowly the old warmth began to return. He started helping me in the garden again, his large hands carefully tending the new tomato seedling. I started baking again, and the scent of lemons and vanilla once more filled my kitchen, no longer a memory of a nightmare but a promise of a new beginning. I never went to Chloe's trial. I didn't need to. I read in the paper that she was found guilty of multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to a long prison term. I felt no joy in it, only a quiet, somber sense of justice. My peace didn't come from her punishment. It came from reclaiming my life, from the slow, steady rebuilding of the bond with my son. Our relationship isn't what it used to be. It's different now. Stronger perhaps, forged in fire and tempered by a terrible truth. We learned that strangers don't inflict the deepest wounds, but those we let into our hearts do. And we knew that love, true love, is not just about blind trust, but about the hard, painful, and beautiful work of forgiveness. It's a strange thing to have your life torn apart and then, piece by piece, put it back together again. The cracks are still there, of course. They'll always be there. But they are a part of my story now, a map of where I've been. I used to think that true evil had a certain face, something you could recognize, something that felt menacing and cold from the start. But I learned a difficult lesson. I knew that sometimes the most profound darkness comes wrapped in a beautiful package, with a charming smile and a voice that sounds like reason itself. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps into your life quietly, patiently, using your own love and goodness as a weapon against you. My story is an extreme one, I know. Not everyone will face a betrayal so meticulously planned, so diabolical. But how many of us have felt that quiet, creeping unease? That feeling when you see a loved one, a son, a daughter, a dear friend, changing under someone else's influence? When your warnings, born of love and instinct, are dismissed as jealousy or control. When you are made to feel like the crazy one, simply for seeing what is right in front of you. I have my son back, and for that I am endlessly grateful. Our love survived the fire. But the question that still haunts me in quiet moments as I sit in my garden watching the sunset is this: how do you truly protect the people you love from a danger they cannot see for themselves? When your love is twisted to look like malice, and a stranger's malice is disguised as love, what can you do but wait and pray and hold on to the hope that the truth will find its way out before it's too late? I want to read your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Knowing that we are not alone in our struggles can be the most incredible comfort of all. If my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and supporting our channel so that more voices can be heard and more lessons can be shared. Thank you for listening.